particularly parents and children. But as we introduce this morning, you know that I said that really there's kind of what we call a rubric. There's kind of a subject that is introduced back in chapter 5 and verse 21. When there we learn that we are to submit ourselves to one another. That is a very godly quality that we do that, because no longer do we realize certainly we are to submit ourselves to God always. But we learn that when we have relationships, think about submission. We learn, for one, we look at this morning, which would have been husbands and wives, and how that wives are to be submissive to their husbands. Well, they probably understood that in their culture pretty well, because they probably were very submissive in that culture. But then Paul went on to say, unless you get the wrong idea, it's not like maybe what you think. But we learn that Christ has elevated the role of the woman, and still while she has a submissive role, we learn that it works very well. And I've never known a woman that is married to a godly husband to have a problem with this. I think that we see that when God has said this, tonight we're going to look at the second of those, which would be of submission. First of all, we see in this text the responsibilities of children to their parents. Once again, look at the text. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. You and you may live long on the earth. Let's think about this in a little bit of detail. First of all, there's something that is said to children that I think that we understand pretty well, and that is to obey your parents. Well, we know, as we said earlier, that always God comes first in everything. However, if we were to think about it just from a practical standpoint, as we think about you young people, wherever you're sitting, and I know most of you are here, but wherever you are, as you think about your responsibility, what does God expect of you? One of the first things that we learn that God wants you to do is to listen to your parents. Not only to listen in the Lord. I know there are probably exceptions to this. You know, my parents led me astray. I wish I never listened to my parents before, because it got me in so much trouble. That usually is not the case. But what is the case is we find out that a lot of children grow up to say, you know, if I listen to my mom or dad more, or listen to what they say to us and the way that we should go, and as long as that does not conflict with the will of God, then we know that we are supposed to obey them as children. It says, for this is right. You know, there are some things that obviously just kind of stand out as being things that you don't have to question. Great thing to do, first of all, because God said so. But then just from a practical point of view, we see that young people love them more than anybody else. Let me tell you something, young people. You'll have a lot of people that love you in this life, and that's a great thing. When you're in church life, there will always be a lot of people that you look up to. You'll always respect, you'll always think about as being great role models for you, because they loved you. But I guarantee you there will be nobody that will love you like a parent will love you. There's just a relationship there, as the Greek would put it, there's that storge love that is different from all the, if they're going to be the parents that God wants them to be, then obviously they're going to lead you in the right ways. So obey your parents in the Lord, for this great statement made there. My son, hear the instruction of your father, and do not forsake the law of your mother. For they will be a graceful ornament on your head, and change all the way through is for children to obey their parents, even as we their parents. Has we to be done. In this matter, but in all many parents. And I see there's a real responsibility for young people in our day to have the kind of response. He knew it in the days of the Ephesian church, and he knows it to be something that is still relevant to us in our day too. The idea of honoring father and mother, and a broad sense of caring for them, even when you're grown and they get older. We sometimes have the responsibility as adult children to start caring for our parents in a way that we never really envisioned. Now that she saw that transition in her life, she said she remembered that time well. She remembered as her mother started getting older, make a pretty big stop. You know, that's just one of those natural instincts. Well, you know that we do that to our children, and that she wouldn't fly off into the dashboard. But now she says by instinct she realizes that she's doing the same for her mom. In Matthew chapter 15, this is one of the things that he says, that you're to honor your father and your mother. Now wait a minute. That money that would have taken care of them, that's Corban. That is dedicated to God. And he said, you have violated the law of God by your traditions. So we learned that throughout Scripture there was always the intent of God for children to honor their father and mother. And here we learn maybe more in the way that we might think of it, and that is we are to respect them. Now, early on we needed to be. But surely if we learn the lesson that is being taught, eventually you're going to get it. And I can remember, and I made this statement in class not too long ago, that there was a statement made a time or two that said, if you do that, you're going to get. I knew what that meant. But something in the middle of next week, but I never wanted to either. And I don't want to say that to let you think that my mom or dad always were making these threatening remarks to us, but I say that kind of tongue-in-cheek to say that we were made to respect. We weren't allowed to talk back. If we did, we got in trouble. We learned to respect them or us. They're kind of the God that we know. Not that they ever called themselves God, but it's that we're learning all the time how to respect those that are in authority over us. And if we learn to respect mom and dad, then later on, it's not any problem for us to learn how to respect God and His laws. There's a big disconnect with a lot of folks in our day in obeying God because they never learned to respect mom and dad when they were at home. So we learn that disrespect for mom and dad in the Bible always has been rated right up there with some of the worst sins that are committed. For example, we go back to Exodus chapter 21. In verse 15, and we learn that if a child were to strike father or mother, he is to be put to death. That was God's law, not one that they came up with. 2 verses later, he said if there is a child that curses father or mother, that child is to be put to death. Then when we get to the New Testament, we'll learn that God did not have that kind of law in Christianity to where someone was dealt with usually right on the spot, especially that they would receive death for that kind of transgression. But in Romans chapter 1 and verse 30, and 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 2, we learn that disobedient to parents would be one of the things that would be characteristic of the evil things that would happen in the last days. And we know that God has not changed His mind about how He feels of this matter. I don't mean that God still wants us to put to death a child that might strike father or mother, but as far as how God looks at that respect that ought to be there, that has not changed. So, young people, let's go back to something we said this morning. If you weren't here, here's what we said. When we obey father and mother, number one, to think that we are obeying God puts us on the right track. It's not just a matter that you're doing what mom or dad said you are, but I want you to think beyond that to realize that God expects me to obey my father and my mother. Number two, I want you to think it isn't a matter of just doing the right thing, but it's also a matter of developing the right attitude. Now, I've got to be honest with you. I'm sure that there were times when I didn't always have the right attitude, even though I might have done what eventually was asked of me. But here we're learning that if you really want to please God, it's an action and it is an attitude. There's sometimes that things come along in your life that just hit you at the right time. And maybe it makes sense to you more than it ever has before. When I went out to Freed-Hardeman as a freshman there, they would have, it was over the social square along the way. To be so. But really made an impact on my life to help me in this area. I told you before that it was often emphasized when I was at school that you young people ought to be thanking your mom and dad for the sacrifices they made to get you here, because it's not cheap to come to a school like this, and it wasn't. But his point was this: there are many reasons why you ought to respect and honor your father and mother. If you just look around you and see some of the things that are going on in this world, you would understand why. He said, let me tell you a little bit about my world and some of the things that I've had to do as a social worker throughout the years and things that I've seen and been exposed to. He said, maybe you've heard of it, but let me tell you that there are some moms and dads, so to speak, that seem to get some kind of warped pleasure out of taking a cigarette and on their young children, burning them just for fun. He said, let me tell you something that kind of was in vogue at one time. In fact, it has a name, and I won't go there. But anyway, he says, here's something. He said, you wonder how people get sometimes to the point they get to. He said that, but there are some parents that will take an infant, more or less with one hand, maybe with two, by the soles, by their feet, anyway, I should say, and get those feet fixed within their hands, and then draw back and sling their babies up against the door facing, sometimes even bursting their heads to where the brain inside comes out. And then he went on to tell many stories like that he had seen, had experienced. And after he finished, he looked at us in the eye and he said, young people, if you can't be thankful for what your parents have done for you, learn to be thankful for some things they didn't do to you. I'm glad that I can be appreciative both ways for the things that my parents did for me, as well as the things they didn't do to me. Whatever it takes, young people, we need to open our eyes and realize that God says, honor your mom and your dad. Then he goes on to say, for this is the first commandment with promise. Maybe a better way of understanding that, this is the first commandment that was given with a promise attached to it, that your days may be long upon this earth. I think there is a general statement that is made there. I don't think it's true in every case, but I think generally that's true. Sometimes accidents happen. Sometimes we have known folks that died at a young age, and maybe they were very respectful, very honoring of their parents. It doesn't hold true in every case, but in most cases it does. And I think that the more practical principle of this, if you'll listen to mom and dad and keep you out of some of the situations that you don't need to be in, and not be involved in things that you ought not be involved in, then it will make your life a whole lot longer, and it will make your life a whole lot better. So children have a responsibility to parents. And that responsibility comes under a broad heading of submission. But then we learned it is obedience and honor, especially, that is to be carried out by our children. But, like it was this morning, unless parents get the wrong idea and maybe consider their children as their property, and they can do with them as they will, it seemed God in His great wisdom thought, well, I need to go on and instruct this a little more so that parents will understand their responsibilities too. So we think particularly here about fathers, because that is the word that is used here. It doesn't mean that fathers are the only ones that have this responsibility. For example, in parenthood, we learn that mothers have responsibility too. Titus 2, 2 Timothy 1 and verse 5, we learn that mothers, grandmothers were involved in this. But here he's pointing the finger at the fathers. And he's saying, fathers, I do not want you to provoke your children to wrath, but I want you to bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Your version may say something a little different, but they all pretty well net the same results. And there are three things that are taught here. Number one, we learn there is leadership. We've said it 100 times. Here's 101st. You can't teach what you don't know, and you can't lead where you don't go. So I'm glad that my mom and dad never sent me to church, but they went too. So when you think about leadership, it's something that you do. You lead the way. Number two, there is instruction. It isn't something that just you do by example only, but there has to be instruction too. We'll go back to Deuteronomy chapter 6 when God said, I want these laws to, first of all, be in your hearts. Then I want you to teach them diligently to your children. When you sit in the house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up. He said, in every situation of life, I want you to teach my ways to your children. Probably some of the best sermons I ever heard were those maybe when my dad and I were out in a fishing boat. Or maybe when my mom and I were out in the garden. Or maybe a lot of things that we did when we were growing up that some of the instruction, and it wasn't necessarily how to catch that fish down there or how to pick that bean off of there so that it's ripe and you ought to be picking. It wasn't that. We were taught that too. But more the life lessons that we learned. It's been emphasized, but I think it's worth maybe just a little more. There is less contact time with parents and children in our day than we've known in many generations. We don't have to go back all that far. Some of us in here, you grew up on a farm. You spent a lot of time with Dad. A lot of you women grew up as young girls spending a lot of time with your mother. That isn't nearly the case now that it used to be. But I think that what we learn, and as we look back, what we see, is that values are more easily caught than they are taught. In other words, just spending time together and learning how to be a woman or learning how to be a man, you see, that's very important to us. And so we learn as fathers, it needs to be leadership, but it also has to take a little time to give instruction, and then it has to be tempered by love. What does it mean? Fathers, provoke not your children to wrath. It means you can be too hard on a child. And you can be too loose on a child. But here in that he's given instructions of what you have to do, he is not saying lighten up and don't do much. He's just saying make sure that everything that you do is tempered by love. And if it is tempered by love, then you don't discourage that child. You don't put too much on him to where he doesn't grow up to follow your ways and rebel when he is old enough or she is old enough to do so. You've seen those situations too. Where we see the situation that a parent or parents were so hard on a child that the best thing they could do is get away from that, and when they're old enough to do so, they did. That's when they were too hard. Their actions were not tempered by love. So therefore, the result was not what they intended for it to be. Let's move here as we start now bringing this to a close. We have learned something about relationships, and there are the responsibilities that children have, their responsibilities in particular that father would have as a leader of that family, but it's not to him exclusively, but the finger pretty well was pointed toward the father's side as this particular text was written. How do children know that they're loved? How do they know they're loved? Number one, most children spell love T-I-M-E. I said a moment ago, there's not nearly as much contact time. But let's break it down and think about our relationship as parents and kids this way. Rather than just being with them in a location somewhere, and that's not all bad. It might be at a ball field, it might be at a concert, it might be this, it might be that. That's fine. We need to be involved in other things. But how much time do you feel that you personally spend with your child on any given day? You see, that's important too. That there's that one-on-one, as we might call it, and use it in a little different way, FaceTime. They need that FaceTime too. You know how children sometimes, and we've had them to do this, and a lot of times we kind of take it as a negative thing, and it is, they do it all the time. But maybe, you're trying to talk to somebody else and they're trying to get your face and turn it toward them. They're trying to say, I want you to listen to me. Now, that has to be in balance, obviously. You can't do that all the time. But if they're doing it a lot, it may tell us a little something that maybe would be of value to us. Number two, listening. There is instructing, but there's also listening. I'm sure that all the things that I used to sit in the kitchen when my mom was fixing a meal were not very interesting to her. other than the fact that it was her son that maybe was talking to her. But I give my mom a lot of credit. I always felt like I was listened to when I talked. That doesn't mean I always got my way, but I did have my say. I was listened to as long as I could say anything respectfully to her. Number 3, doing what the child wants to do. Obviously, there again, has to be within reason. But a child perceives that he is loved when every once in a while you'll do something that that child wants to do. I want to play this. My story. I want to play Lucky Ducks. No, surely there's something else you'd rather play than that. But every now and then I'll even play Lucky Ducks because I want to do something that they want to do. Give them some responsibility. That doesn't mean that you burden them down to where they are out, plowing the back 40 every day. I'm not saying that's all a bad thing either. But what I am saying is that every child needs some responsibility because it feels like to them that they get a part. They have a stake in this family. And then telling them and affirming your love. One thing that Carolyn and I did get to hear a lot when we were growing up is that our parents literally told us on a regular basis that they loved us. And my dad told me that, and until I got to be a teenager, he'd come by and kiss me on the jaw before he'd go to work. And after a while, that got a little harder for me. But, after a while, then you kind of figure out, I kind of wish he were around so he still could do that. So telling them and affirming your love is a wonderful way of letting your child know that they are loved. But then, drawing this to a conclusion here tonight, from God's perspective, here are 2 things. They might be as simple as falling off a log, but 2 things that we need to hear before we leave here tonight. Number 1, a parent's number 1 responsibility is to teach his or her children about God. It's a great thing that parents come and they're engaged in Bible class and they see that their kids are involved in a Bible class and they're here for worship service and that they're here every time the church meets. That's a wonderful thing. But I've always thought that really the church, the Bible class teacher and all those folks, they are our helpers to do what number 1 is our responsibility. In other words, I might teach my child well, I might send him to a school where he can be well educated and all those kinds of things, but if I fail to teach my child about God, then I've failed in my number 1 responsibility. And I shouldn't leave that into the hands of everybody else. They again can be great helpers, but number 1, it is the parent's responsibility to see that their children know God's ways. Number 2, when it comes to the young person, your number 1 responsibility in life is to live for Jesus. You might say, well, that's true with parents too. Well, it is. But let's go back to what I said earlier. If you will give your heart to following Jesus above all other things, even when your parent tells you no and you don't like it, you still can say, but I can do this because I know this is what God expects of me. One day you'll change your mind as to how you might feel from that particular moment. I was there, I remember, long enough back to realize that sometimes when I wasn't able to go to certain places I asked to go, even though I said everybody else was going to be there, and I used all those things, I didn't always go along with that. Sometimes I was kind of brokenhearted. I didn't get to do some of the things that I thought everybody else was getting to do. Going to find out hardly ever did everybody get to do them either. But the truth is, even when sometimes I became a little angry because my mom or dad would not allow me to do certain things, later on, I found out that at least 99% of the time, they were right in their decision. But if I live for Jesus, then I do what Jesus has asked me to do. As a child, I obey, I respect my parents. As a parent, I lead by word and example my children in the way that they should go. and that is following in the footsteps of Jesus. So again tonight, we learn, or we are reminded of valuable lessons that God has given us about relationships, and especially of parents and children. We're going to sing a song of encouragement. Gatlin has already told us the number. It may be tonight that someone needs to make his or her life right with God. If tonight you're subject to the Lord's invitation, would you come while together we stand and sing?